New Year's Ghost Stories. The New Year is a time for fresh beginnings, resolutions and celebrations. But in Ireland, where the veil between the natural and supernatural has always been thin, it's also a time for stories of mystery and the macabre. From ancient folklore to chilling modern encounters, New Year's Eve and Day have long been seen as moments when the boundaries blur and spirits walk among us. Tonight, we'll uncover 10 haunting tales tied to the new year, stories of ghostly apparitions, cursed artifacts, and eerie traditions that serve as a reminder. While we may look to the future with hope, the past often lingers closer than we'd like. Prepare yourself for an unsettling journey into Ireland's most chilling New Year legends. The Phantom of the First Foot. In the quiet village of Ballylough, nestled in the rolling hills of County Wicklow, New Year's Eve had always been marked by a peculiar tradition. At the stroke of midnight, the first visitor, or first footer, was believed to bring luck or misfortune for the year ahead. The rules were simple. The first footer had to be dark-haired and arrive bearing gifts: coal, bread and whiskey, symbolizing warmth, sustenance and good cheer. For decades, the villagers followed this custom with unwavering faith, but whispers of a darker tale lingered in the shadows. According to local lore, an ominous figure known only as the Shadow would sometimes take the role of the first footer. This figure, they said, was no man but a spectre, foretelling tragedy for the household it visited. While some dismissed the story as a fireside yarn, the elders of Ballylough treated it with a quiet reverence, muttering prayers whenever the tale was mentioned. It was New Year's Eve in 1923 when the legend took a sinister turn. The O'Connor family, renowned for hosting the most lavish celebrations in Ballylough, had thrown open their doors to neighbours and friends. The air was thick with laughter, music, and the aroma of stewed mutton and freshly baked bread. A fiddler played lively tunes by the hearth, and the younger guests danced in the flickering firelight. As the countdown to midnight began, a loud knock echoed through the house, silencing the revelry. Everyone turned to stare at the door. A few of the older guests exchanged uneasy glances, murmuring about the timing of the visitor. It was highly unusual for a first-footer to arrive uninvited. Mr. O'Connor, a broad-shouldered man with a booming laugh, strode confidently to the door, determined not to let superstition ruin the night. But as he opened it, the smile faltered on his lips. Standing in the doorway was a tall figure cloaked in black. A wide-brimmed hat obscured his face, and his hands, pale and bony, held out the traditional gifts: a lump of coal, a stale loaf of bread, and an empty flask. "I come bearing gifts," the stranger intoned, his voice low and rasping. The cold air from outside seemed to follow him in, chilling the room despite the roaring fire. Hesitant but unwilling to appear rude, Mr. O'Connor invited the man inside. The stranger moved through the crowd with an eerie silence, his presence casting a pall over the once joyous atmosphere. At the stroke of midnight, he raised his glass, an empty one, to the gathered crowd. His voice cut through the silence like a knife. "To the new year," he said, "and to those who will not see its end." As the last word left his lips, the candles flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. When light was restored, the stranger had vanished. The only trace of him was the gifts he had left behind, now lying on the floor. The year that followed was one of the darkest in Ballylough's history. A mysterious illness swept through the village, claiming the lives of several residents. The O'Connors lost their home in a devastating fire, and the once thriving crops withered under an unrelenting drought. Those who had witnessed the events of that New Year's Eve whispered that the Shadow had returned to Ballylough, bringing ruin in its wake. To this day, villagers avoid being the first to cross a threshold on New Year's Day, fearing they might encounter the phantom that cursed Ballylough so long ago. And on New Year's Eve, as midnight approaches, the people of Ballylough gather close, hoping that the knock they hear at the door will be from a friend and not from the Shadow. The Banshees' New Year's Wail. The McGrath family farm in County Clare sat at the edge of a dense forest, a place of quiet beauty and deep mystery. On New Year's Eve, the McGraths would gather to honour their ancestors with a meal and a moment of silence at midnight, a tradition passed down for generations. This particular New Year's Eve was bitterly cold. Frost glittered on the bare branches outside as Mary McGrath lit a candle in the window, a gesture of welcome for the spirits of their loved ones. Her husband, Eamon, and their two children, Ina and Connor, sat around the table, enjoying the warmth of the hearth as the clock edged closer to midnight. The family had barely finished their supper when a piercing wail echoed through the night. It was a high, keening sound that froze the blood and silenced even the crackling fire. Mary's hand flew to her chest. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Eamon nodded grimly. "It's just the wind," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. He rose and went to the door, peering out into the night. The sound came again, louder this time, and unmistakably human. Mary clutched her children close. "It's her," she whispered, her face pale. "The banshee." The McGraths, like many Irish families, had their own tale of a banshee. Their ancestors claimed to have been visited by the wailing spirit on the eve of great misfortunes. Some said she was a harbinger of death. Others believed she mourned for those she could not save. Eamon returned to the table, bolting the door behind him. "We'll stay inside," he said firmly, though his eyes darted toward the window as the wailing rose again. It seemed to move closer, circling the house like a predator stalking its prey. The family huddled together, their fear mounting as the sound grew unbearable. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was so profound it seemed to press against their ears. Cautiously, Mary approached the window. In the flickering candlelight, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was a woman, her long hair streaming in the wind, her pale face turned toward the house. She wore a tattered grey cloak, and her eyes shone with an unnatural light. Mary gasped and stepped back, but the figure did not move. "Eamon," she whispered. "She's here." Eamon joined her at the window, his face ashen. "Don't look at her," he said. "Close the curtains." But as Mary reached for the fabric, the banshee raised her hand and pointed toward the house. Her mouth opened in another wail, a sound so mournful it brought tears to Mary's eyes. Then she turned and vanished into the shadows. The family spent the rest of the night in fearful silence, jumping at every creak and gust of wind. When dawn broke, they ventured outside to find the frost-covered ground undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. But the banshee's warning had not been in vain. In the weeks that followed, tragedy struck the McGraths. A fire swept through their barn, killing their livestock and leaving them destitute. Eamon fell ill, his strength fading until he could no longer work the land. The family's misfortunes multiplied, just as the banshee had foretold. To this day, the McGraths light a candle every New Year's Eve, praying it will keep the banshee and her sorrowful wails at bay. The Midnight Dance at Dunmore Woods. Nestled on the outskirts of County Loa, Dunmore Woods was a place of whispered legends and unspoken fears. Though the forest was beautiful by day, with sunlit clearings and ancient oaks, it transformed at night. Locals avoided it entirely, especially on New Year's Eve, when the veil between the human world and the fairy realm was said to be at its thinnest. The legend went that at midnight on New Year's Eve, the Fae held a grand revel in the heart of the woods. It was said that anyone foolish enough to stumble upon their gathering would be drawn into the dance, never to return. Most dismissed the tale as old superstition, but for Patrick O'Shea, a sceptical young man with a knack for courting danger, it was an irresistible challenge. On New Year's Eve, Patrick armed himself with a flask of whiskey and a lantern and set off toward Dunmore Woods. He was determined to prove the legend false and return to the village a hero, or at least with a story to tell. The forest was eerily quiet as Patrick stepped beneath the canopy of twisted branches. The moonlight struggled to penetrate the dense foliage, casting strange shadows that flickered with the swaying of his lantern. Patrick took a deep swig of whiskey to steady his nerves and pressed on, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. As midnight approached, he began to hear faint music. It was a haunting melody, unlike anything he'd ever heard, both beautiful and unsettling. Against his better judgment, Patrick followed the sound, weaving through the trees until he came upon a clearing bathed in silvery light. There, beneath the gnarled branches, the Fae were dancing. Their figures were ethereal, glowing faintly in the darkness. Some appeared human, while others were strange and otherworldly, with elongated limbs and shimmering wings. They moved with an unnatural grace, their laughter echoing like wind chimes. Patrick froze, his breath caught in his throat. The sight was mesmerizing, yet a deep instinct urged him to turn back. But before he could move, one of the Fae turned and met his gaze. She was stunning, with hair like spun gold and eyes as deep as the night sky. "Come," she called, her voice like the whisper of leaves. "Join us." Patrick felt his feet move of their own accord. He stepped into the clearing, his lantern falling to the ground. The music swelled, and the Fae encircled him, their hands reaching out to pull him into their dance. As he moved, the world blurred, time losing all meaning. He felt weightless, euphoric, as if he were part of the music itself. But as the hours passed, Patrick began to notice strange things. His feet, though moving, never touched the ground. The Fae's laughter grew sharper, their smiles more sinister. He looked down and saw his hands aging before his eyes, the skin growing thin and translucent. A voice from deep within him screamed to stop, but the pull of the dance was too strong. Desperate, Patrick remembered an old piece of advice his grandmother had given him. Always carry iron in the woods. With trembling hands, he fumbled for the small iron horseshoe he'd taken as a trinket and flung it to the ground. The effect was immediate. The music screeched to a halt, and the Fae recoiled, their faces twisted in rage. The golden-haired woman shrieked, her voice splitting the air. Patrick stumbled backward, falling to the frozen ground as the Fae vanished into the darkness. When Patrick awoke, it was dawn. He lay in the clearing, surrounded by frost-covered grass. His lantern was cold and dark, his flask empty beside him. Staggering to his feet, he made his way back to the village. The memory of the Fae's dance burned into his mind. He returned home, but he was never the same. His hair had turned white, his once strong frame frail and bent. Though he survived, a part of him had been left behind in the fairy ring, forever tied to the midnight dance in Dunmore woods. To this day, no one dares enter the forest on New Year's Eve, lest they too become a victim of the Fae's haunting revelry. The Haunted Bell of St. Stephen's Church. St. Stephen's Church, perched on a windswept hill in County Meath, had stood for over 3 centuries. Once a beacon of hope and community, it was now an abandoned relic, its crumbling walls wrapped in ivy and its bell tower leaning precariously against the grey Irish skies. Yet, for all its disrepair, the church was infamous for its cursed New Year's Eve bell. According to local lore, the church's bell had been silenced for over 100 years. On the last New Year's Eve it had rung. A tragedy had unfolded so horrific that the villagers vowed never to use the bell again. But each year, as the clock struck midnight, the bell tolled anyway, its mournful chime echoing across the countryside. In 1925, a group of adventurous teenagers decided to investigate the legend. Sean, Kathleen, and their younger cousin Eileen had grown up hearing the stories of the haunted bell, but had never dared to visit the church at night. That New Year's Eve, emboldened by youthful curiosity and a flask of whiskey borrowed from Sean's father, they ventured up the hill. The church loomed against the moonlit sky, its broken stained-glass windows casting strange patterns of light on the ground. The air grew colder as they approached, and a heavy silence settled around them, broken only by the crunch of frost under their boots. "Let's see if the bell is even there," Sean said, trying to mask his nervousness. He led the way inside, his lantern illuminating the decayed pews and cobwebbed altar. The air smelled of damp stone and decay, and their breaths clouded in the freezing air. The bell tower's spiral staircase was treacherous, but they climbed it anyway, their hands clutching the iron railing slick with moss. At the top, they found the bell, a massive, rusting relic suspended by fraying ropes. It hung motionless, yet an eerie energy seemed to radiate from it. "It doesn't look like it's rung in decades," Kathleen said, running her fingers over the engraved inscription. It was Latin, but none of them could read it. Midnight was fast approaching, and they decided to stay until the hour struck. As the moments ticked by, an unnatural chill filled the tower. Eileen shivered, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I don't feel right," she whispered. "Maybe we should go." Before anyone could respond, the bell moved. It started with a faint creak, the rope swaying as if tugged by unseen hands. Then, as the clock struck 12, the bell tolled. Its sound was deafening, a deep, resonant chime that reverberated through their very bones. The teens clapped their hands over their ears, but the noise seemed to come from inside their heads, drowning out their panicked cries. The bell's chime brought more than sound, it brought visions. The teenagers saw flashes of a long-ago New Year's Eve when the church was packed with parishioners. A fire had broken out, trapping the congregation inside. The priest, desperate to save his flock, had rung the bell to summon help, but the tower collapsed before anyone could escape. The priest's spirit, racked with guilt, was said to haunt the bell, forcing it to toll each new year to atone for his failure. As the vision faded, the teens found themselves back in the silent tower, the bell still swaying gently. They fled the church, their hearts pounding, and never spoke of the night again. The next morning, the villagers found the bell cracked clean through, its toll silenced for good. But the legend of St. Stephen's Church remains. On New Year's Eve, those who dare venture close swear they can hear the faint echo of the haunted bell, a ghostly reminder of the lives lost and the priest who could never rest. The ghostly Revelers of Kinale Harbour. Kinale Harbour, with its picturesque coastline and colourful village, is a place of beauty by day. But as night falls, the harbour takes on a more sinister reputation. Locals tell of ghostly ships that appear every New Year's Eve, bringing with them the lost souls of sailors claimed by the sea. The legend dates back to 1783, a year marked by a violent storm that battered the Irish coast. On the night of December 31st, a fleet of fishing boats, determined to bring in a final haul for the year, ignored the warnings of an approaching tempest. As midnight struck, the storm unleashed its fury, capsizing boats and swallowing sailors into the dark, frigid waters. Not a single man from the fleet returned, and their families mourned their loss as the new year began. Over 2 centuries later, the story had become part of Kinale's folklore, a tale told to warn against tempting the sea's wrath. But for some, the legend was more than a cautionary tale. It was a haunting truth. On New Year's Eve in 1997, Patrick Flynn, a seasoned fisherman, and his son Rory set out to the harbour to prepare their boat for a morning voyage. Though Patrick was not one to believe in ghost stories, Rory often teased him about the phantom fleet that was said to appear each year. "Don't let the ghosts pull you into the water," Rory joked, his grin fading as Patrick gave him a stern look. "Mind your tongue, lad," Patrick replied. "The sea respects no man, living or dead." As the clock approached midnight, a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the harbour. Patrick and Rory worked quietly, their voices swallowed by the damp air. Suddenly, a faint light appeared on the water, followed by another and another. It was as though a fleet of lantern-lit boats had emerged from the mist. Patrick squinted, his heart quickening. "What in God's name?" he murmured. The boats were unlike any he had ever seen, their sails tattered and their hulls encrusted with barnacles. Figures moved on the decks, men in tattered clothing, their faces pale and gaunt. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their movements were unnaturally fluid, as though they floated rather than walked. One of the ghostly ships glided closer, its prow cutting through the water silently. Patrick felt a chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. A figure on the deck raised an arm and pointed toward them. The sound of ghostly voices singing a mournful shanty filled the air, the words unintelligible but heavy with sorrow. Rory grabbed his father's arm. "Da, we need to go," he whispered, his voice trembling. Before Patrick could respond, the ship's crew began to lower a net into the water, as if preparing to haul in a catch. But the net wasn't cast into the sea. It drifted toward the Flynn's boat, its shadowy threads reaching out like grasping hands. Patrick acted quickly, yanking the motor's cord and steering the boat away from the ghostly fleet. The fog seemed to thicken, and the voices grew louder, their haunting melody chasing them across the water. It wasn't until they reached the safety of the dock that the fog lifted and the ghostly lights disappeared. Back on shore, Rory was pale and shaken. "Duh, what was that?" Patrick shook his head. "The sea's own revenge," he said quietly. "Let it stay in the past." To this day, the ghostly fleet is said to appear each New Year's Eve, a chilling reminder of the lives lost in the storm of 1783. The locals avoid the harbour at midnight, leaving it to the spirits of the sailors who never came home. The Black Swan of Lough Ree. Lough Ree, a vast and tranquil lake stretching across the counties of Longford, Westmeath and Roscommon, is a place of serene beauty. But beneath its glassy surface lies a chilling legend, one that resurfaces every New Year's Eve when the ghostly Black Swan is said to appear. The story begins with Lady Eliza Warren, a young aristocrat who lived near the shores of Lough Ree in the early 1800s. She was betrothed to Henry Boyle, a wealthy but cold-hearted landowner. Their New Year's Eve wedding was planned as the event of the season, a union that promised to unite two of the region's most influential families. But Lady Eliza had a secret. She was in love with another, a poor fisherman named Callum, whose warm smile and kind heart had won her over. On the eve of her wedding, she met Callum by the lake's edge, planning to elope under the cover of darkness. However, their plan was discovered by Henry, who arrived at the lakeshore with his men just as the lovers prepared to board Callum's small boat. Consumed by rage and jealousy, Henry ordered his men to destroy the boat, leaving Callum to drown in the icy waters. Eliza, overcome with grief, threw herself into the lake, her screams echoing into the night. As the waters closed over her, the legend says a black swan emerged from the lake, its mournful cry piercing the air before it disappeared into the fog. From that night on, the black swan became a symbol of tragedy, appearing each New Year's Eve to herald misfortune for anyone who dared disturb the lake. In 1978, the O'Hanlon family, new residents of a small cottage on the lake's shore, dismissed the legend as mere folklore. That New Year's Eve, they decided to celebrate with a bonfire and fireworks by the water's edge. As midnight approached, the family, Patricia, her husband Seamus, and their teenage children Oif and Liam, gathered around the flickering flames. The festivities were in full swing when Oif noticed a dark shape gliding across the lake's surface. "Look!" she called, pointing toward the water. A black swan emerged from the mist, its feathers sleek and shining like polished obsidian. It moved with an unnatural grace, its crimson eyes fixed on the family. The air grew heavy, the laughter fading as a chilling silence enveloped the shore. Patricia felt a deep unease. "It's just a bird," she said, though her voice wavered. But the swan began to circle, its cries growing louder and more mournful. The flames of the bonfire flickered and dimmed, and the air grew icy cold. Without warning, the swan spread its wings and let out an ear-splitting screech. The sound seemed to vibrate through the earth itself, and the family stumbled backward in fear. Suddenly, the lake surged. Waves crashed against the shore, soaking the family and extinguishing the bonfire. The swan disappeared beneath the churning waters, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. The next day, the O'Hanlons awoke to find their home flooded. Pipes had burst inexplicably, leaving their belongings drenched and ruined. Over the next year, their misfortunes multiplied. Failed crops, a barn fire, and a mysterious illness that left Patricia bedridden for months. The family eventually moved away, convinced that their New Year's Eve celebration had angered the restless spirits of Lough Ree. To this day, the locals warn against disturbing the lake on New Year's Eve. The black swan, they say, still glides across the water, mourning its lost love and punishing those who dare to disrupt its eternal vigil. The Cursed Clockmaker of Dublin. In the heart of Dublin's Liberties District, there once stood a small, cluttered workshop owned by a man named Thomas Quinlan. Known locally as the Clockmaker, Thomas was famed for his exquisite craftsmanship. His clocks adorned the city's grandest homes, their intricate designs and precise mechanisms earning him renown. Yet his story, like many in old Dublin, ended in tragedy, leaving behind a chilling legacy that resurfaces every New Year's Eve. Thomas Quinlan's trouble began in 1895 when he was commissioned to craft a clock for Lord Barrington, a powerful and notoriously cruel landlord. Barrington demanded a masterpiece that would chime only at midnight on New Year's Eve, symbolizing the turning of the year and, as he put it, the eternal triumph of time. Thomas poured his heart and soul into the creation. The clock was magnificent, a towering mahogany piece with golden filigree, its pendulum shaped like a serpent swallowing its own tail, a symbol of eternity. At the top, a glass dome housed tiny figurines that moved in a graceful waltz when the clock struck 12. But when the time came to deliver the clock, Barrington refused to pay the full amount, accusing Thomas of tardiness. Desperate and humiliated, Thomas begged for the rest of his payment, only to be thrown out of Barrington's mansion. That winter was harsh, and Thomas, unable to pay his debts, lost his home and workshop. He died in the snow outside Barrington's gates on New Year's Eve, his masterpiece still ticking inside the mansion. The following year, as the clock struck midnight, a strange phenomenon occurred. The chime echoed louder than usual, reverberating through the mansion as if the clock were alive. Lord Barrington awoke to find the clock glowing faintly, its pendulum swinging faster than it should. When he approached, he heard a voice, low and menacing, whispering his name. Terrified, Barrington tried to destroy the clock, but every attempt failed. Axes broke against its surface, fire refused to scorch its wood, and even dismantling it left the pieces mysteriously reassembling themselves. Barrington grew paranoid, hearing the clock's chimes at all hours, though no one else did. On New Year's Eve, 1896, he was found dead in front of the clock, his face frozen in a mask of terror. From that night on, the clock vanished and the mansion fell into ruin. The legend of Thomas Quinlan's cursed clock might have faded into obscurity were it not for a peculiar incident in 1998. At an antique shop in Dublin, a woman named Fiona Kelly purchased an ornate clock that had recently been unearthed during the renovation of an old estate. The shopkeeper warned her of its eerie history, but Fiona dismissed it as folklore. On New Year's Eve, Fiona hosted a party, proudly displaying the clock as a centerpiece. As the hour approached midnight, she noticed the pendulum's movement growing erratic. Her guests watched in uneasy silence as the figurines under the dome began to spin, faster and faster, though the clock's mechanisms had not been wound. When the clock struck 12, the room was engulfed in an otherworldly sound, a chime that seemed to resonate through their very souls. A gust of icy wind swept through the house, extinguishing every candle. In the darkness, Fiona heard a whisper, faint but unmistakable. Time always wins. The lights returned moments later, and the clock stood still, its pendulum frozen. The next day, Fiona found it dismantled, its pieces scattered across the room. She tried to have it repaired, but no clockmaker could explain its strange behaviour. Fearful, she sold it to a collector, where it disappeared once again. To this day, rumours persist of Thomas Quinlan's cursed creation. Each New Year's Eve, the clock is said to resurface, bringing its haunting chime and the chilling message of the clockmaker's revenge. The Spectre of New Year's Day in Kilkenny. Kilkenny, with its cobblestone streets and medieval charm, is a city steeped in history and mystery. But few tales are as chilling as that of the ghostly widow who roams the streets on New Year's Day. Known simply as the Spectre of New Year's Day, she is said to appear each year, her wails echoing through the quiet morning air, mourning the loss of her children in a tragedy that unfolded long ago. The story dates back to the winter of 1851. Margaret O'Shea, a seamstress, lived in a modest cottage on the edge of town with her two young children, Michael and Nora. Widowed at a young age, Margaret worked tirelessly to provide for her family. Despite their struggles, the O'Sheas found joy in simple traditions, particularly the New Year's feast, which Margaret prepared every year to welcome blessings for the year ahead. That New Year's Eve, a biting cold swept through Kilkenny. Margaret had just finished sewing a garment for a wealthy client when she heard a knock at the door. Outside stood a man in fine but tattered clothing, his face pale and gaunt. He claimed to be a traveller in need of shelter from the cold. Though wary, Margaret's kind heart could not refuse him, and she invited him in. The man warmed himself by the fire, his eyes scanning the room with an unsettling intensity. Margaret offered him food, but he declined, staring instead at her children. "Lovely little ones," he murmured, his voice like the wind through a graveyard. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine, but said nothing. As midnight approached, the traveller rose abruptly. "Thank you for your kindness," he said, though his tone carried no warmth. He placed a coin on the table, an ancient-looking piece Margaret had never seen before, and left without another word. When she picked up the coin, it was icy cold to the touch, and a strange unease settled over her. The next morning, Margaret awoke to a dreadful silence. Her children, who normally greeted the new year with laughter, were nowhere to be found. Panicked, she searched the cottage, then ran out into the frosty streets, calling their names. Neighbours joined the search, but there was no trace of Michael and Nora. Days turned into weeks, and still the children were not found. Margaret, consumed by grief, wandered the streets day and night, clutching the strange coin the traveller had left. She claimed the man had stolen her children, though no one else had seen him. By the time spring arrived, Margaret had wasted away from sorrow. She was last seen walking toward the River Nore, her thin frame shrouded in a tattered shawl. When the river was searched days later, only the coin was found on the riverbank, cold as ever. Since then, Kilkenny residents have reported sightings of a spectral woman each New Year's Day. Dressed in a flowing black gown, she drifts through the streets, her face pale and tear-streaked. Her wails echo through the quiet morning, a sorrowful cry for her lost children. Those who have seen her say she clutches something in her hand, a coin that gleams like frost in the pale light. In 1972, a group of young men claimed to have followed the ghost, determined to solve the mystery. They said she led them to the edge of the River Nore before vanishing into the mist. One of them found a coin lying on the ground, identical to the one Margaret had described. He kept it as a curiosity, but within weeks, his life fell into chaos. His business failed, his home was robbed, and he fell gravely ill. Convinced the coin was cursed, he threw it into the river, where it disappeared. To this day, the Spectre of New Year's Day continues her mournful vigil, her story a warning to those who cross paths with the mysterious traveller. Locals avoid the streets on New Year's morning, leaving them to the ghostly widow who still searches for her children. The Witch of the Wishing Well. In the remote countryside of County Donegal, nestled within a dense forest, lies an ancient stone well known as the Wishing Well of Balshannan. Its waters are said to hold mystical powers, granting a single wish to those who dare approach it on New Year's Eve at midnight. But the well is also shrouded in foreboding tales, for legend claims it is guarded by the ghost of a witch, eternally bound to protect its magic from the unworthy. The story begins centuries ago with a woman named Maeve O'Cleary. She was a healer, renowned for her herbal remedies and charms. Though some respected her, others whispered accusations of witchcraft. When a devastating illness swept through Balshannan in 1693, desperate villagers sought Maeve's aid. She tirelessly worked to save the sick, but when her remedies failed to cure the Lord's son, she was accused of poisoning him. Dragged before an angry mob, Maeve protested her innocence, but the villagers would not be swayed. They bound her and threw her into the well, cursing her name as she sank beneath its icy waters. From that day, the well's water ran impossibly clear, and strange occurrences were reported, wishes granted to those in need, but punishments meted out to the greedy. The legend might have been forgotten were it not for the events of New Year's Eve 1975. A local man named Brendan Keane, notorious for his gambling debts, decided to test the legend. Desperate to change his fortunes, Brendan trekked through the forest to the Wishing Well under a pale winter moon. The forest was silent except for the crunch of frost beneath his boots. As he approached the clearing where the well stood, a strange stillness settled over the air. The moss-covered stones of the well glistened in the moonlight, and the water shimmered as though alive. Brendan knelt by the well and tossed a silver coin into its depths. "I wish for wealth beyond measure," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. For a moment nothing happened. Then the water began to ripple, though no wind stirred the air. Out of the shadows stepped a figure, a woman in a flowing black cloak, her face veiled but her eyes glowing an unearthly green. "Do you seek the well's gift?" she asked, her voice both melodic and menacing. Brendan nodded, though his heart raced with fear. "I do." The woman tilted her head. "And what will you sacrifice in return?" "I've nothing to give," he stammered. The witch's laugh rang out, cold and hollow. "The well demands balance. Your greed has sealed your fate." Before Brendan could react, the water surged upward, enveloping him in icy tendrils. He struggled and screamed, but the water dragged him into the well's depths. By dawn, there was no sign of him, only the silver coin he had tossed, lying on the frost-covered stones. In the years that followed, tales of the witch and the well grew. Those who approached with pure intentions, wishing for the health of a loved one or the prosperity of their community, reported seeing a faint glow in the water and receiving their heart's desire. But those driven by greed or malice vanished without a trace, their fates sealed by Maeve's ghostly judgment. Even today, the Wishing Well of Ballamore remains a place of both wonder and fear. Locals warn visitors to stay away, especially on New Year's Eve when the witch's presence is strongest. But every so often, a reckless soul ventures into the forest, lured by the promise of the well's magic. They say the witch's green eyes can still be seen glowing in the shadows, watching, waiting, ready to pass judgment on those who dare disturb her eternal vigil. The Fairy Ring of Balshannan. On the windswept hills outside Balshannan, County Donegal, lies a circle of ancient stones known as the Fairy Ring. Overgrown with moss and wildflowers, it is a quiet yet eerie place that locals avoid, especially on New Year's Eve. According to legend, the ring is a sacred gathering spot for the Fae, who hold their midnight revelries there to mark the turning of the year. Disturbing their celebration, it is said, brings a curse that can last for generations. In 1982, the McHugh family learned this lesson in the harshest way. They had recently moved to Balshannan, hoping for a fresh start. Their new home bordered the hill where the fairy ring lay, but being outsiders, they were unaware of its significance. That year, the McHughs decided to host a New Year's Eve bonfire to celebrate their first holiday in their new home. Neighbours had warned them to steer clear of the ring, but Jack McHugh brushed off their concerns. "It's just a bunch of rocks," he scoffed as he began gathering firewood. His wife Maureen and their teenage children, Sean and Eoif, followed his lead, eager to enjoy the night. As midnight approached, the fire crackled brightly and the family toasted the new year with cider and laughter. But as the clock struck 12, the mood shifted. The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the trees with an unnatural force. The flames flickered and dimmed, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance around the circle of stones. Then they heard it, a faint, lilting music drifting from the ring. It was hauntingly beautiful, yet filled with an unsettling undercurrent, like a song meant to lure rather than comfort. The family froze, their laughter silenced. "Must be the wind," Jack muttered, though his voice lacked confidence. Eoif stepped closer to the ring, drawn by the music. "It's coming from there," she whispered, pointing to the stones. The air around them grew colder, and a strange mist began to swirl within the ring, glowing faintly in the firelight. Suddenly a figure emerged from the mist. It was a woman, impossibly radiant, with hair like spun silver and eyes that gleamed like starlight. She smiled, but it was a smile devoid of warmth. More figures appeared, men and women with otherworldly beauty, their movements graceful yet unnervingly precise. "You have disturbed our revelry," the woman said, her voice soft but commanding. "What will you offer to make amends?" Jack, now trembling, stammered, We didn't mean any harm. We didn't know." The woman's expression hardened. "Ignorance is no excuse. A debt must be paid." Before anyone could respond, the Fae began to circle the family, their movements quick and disorienting. The music grew louder, drowning out the McHugh's pleas. The mist thickened, and the fire extinguished itself with a hiss, plunging them into darkness. When the family awoke the next morning, they were back in their home, but something was different. The air inside felt heavy, and an eerie silence pervaded the house. Over the following weeks, strange occurrences plagued them. Objects moving on their own, whispered voices in empty rooms, and vivid nightmares that left them exhausted and afraid. Worse still, their fortunes took a sharp downturn. Jack lost his job, their crops failed, and Sean and Oaf fell ill with ailments no doctor could diagnose. The neighbours, seeing their plight, shook their heads knowingly. "They angered the Fae," they whispered. "Only an offering can lift the curse." Desperate, Maureen returned to the fairy ring with a basket of gifts, milk, honey, bread and coins as tradition dictated. She placed them within the circle and begged for forgiveness. Though the family's misfortunes eased somewhat after that, the shadows in their home never fully disappeared, and the McHughs eventually left Balshannan, seeking peace elsewhere. To this day, the fairy ring of Balshannan remains untouched. Locals warn newcomers to steer clear, especially on New Year's Eve, lest they incur the wrath of the Fae and find themselves forever bound by their otherworldly debt. As the clock strikes midnight, we embrace the new year with excitement and trepidation, wondering what lies ahead. But these stories remind us of the timeless power of the unknown, of curses that linger, spirits that return, and traditions that warn us to tread carefully in moments when the veil is thin. Whether you celebrate with laughter and light or pause to honour the shadows of the past, may your new year be filled with peace, and perhaps just a touch of the mysterious magic that makes Ireland's folklore so unforgettable. Thank you for joining us on this journey into Ireland's haunted New Year tales. Until next time, keep the lanterns burning and